Who is Homer anyway?
One of the biggest controversies that you can find about the Odyssey. We're calling it the translation wars.
Bring it on.
But it may be of pre-Greek origin, Sophie. That's how old this is.
Yeah, this is seriously old.
The Greek gods, honestly, I think they've got less emotional regulation than the average Love Island contestant.
When you look at the Iliad, at the crux of it is the question of what is actually worth dying for. But when you look at the Odyssey, it's about what's worth living for.
Coming up in this episode, we look at who is Odysseus? What is the plot? Very quickly, so you can take part in any dinner party conversation. We look at some major themes like the double standards, from sexual fidelity to morality. Hospitality is a major point.
How relevant the Odyssey still is 3,000 years later.
Absolutely. It is honestly the blueprint of Western literature, and we're about to tell you why.
Hello and welcome to the Bibliophiles. I'm Sophie.
And I'm Chaya.
And before we get into today's podcast, we just wanted to say thank you so much for listening. And if you like what we do here, please do like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We so appreciate it.
Today's episode is on the Odyssey. Now, when we decided that as the film was coming out, we should do the episode, we didn't just read the Odyssey because that would have been normal. Read the book. Maybe watch a few deep dives from a classicist.
Like 3 or 4, maybe.
Sophie and I have undertaken undergraduate degrees and masters in classics in the last few weeks. We have been down every rabbit hole.
Everyone.
I can't open a tab on my phone anymore.
I can barely function. I only have one functioning eye currently. It's not a joke. I actually think it's quite amazing that we have managed to make it here today to talk about the Odyssey. I mean, we both have a lot of tabs, and you know how we feel about tabs. But
I found lectures from the 90s that I've been reading.
Yeah, we've been to places I don't think any
You've
people
prepared
have been.
for Aviva.
I have, but we are going to do our absolute best to keep this as slick as we possibly can. And let me just tell you, we have spent approximately 7 hours and 23 minutes, would you say, on deciding how we're going to work this out structurally? That's probably about right. So a lot of thought has gone into this. And look, we know that people come to the Odyssey. It's a book for many that they've read from childhood, a bedtime story. Then you've got people like Madeline Miller, the top classics professors in the world who are reading this on another level.
Studying it for decades.
But we hope that this episode brings something for everyone.
Oh my God, absolutely. I want the classicists to be like, gosh, I didn't know that. They found something that we didn't know.
We all?
But then we're going to approach this very, very accessibly because it's for someone who may just be about to watch the film. It's just come out. When this podcast goes live, it will have been out for 3 days and I will have already seen it in IMAX because I'm going all out. If you've never read the book, if you just want to be part of the conversation, if you're like me, you have a background in classics, but you want to have a massive refresh, this is it.
So what we've done is create an elite literary companion. I think that's what we're calling it now.
Absolutely.
Falling Further is the name.
And we opened 500 tabs so you don't have to. It's every random rabbit hole, Reddit thread, all in one place, organised. It's honestly hundreds of hours of our hyperfixations, from Alexandrian criticism, the etymology, the Athena's aegis, individual monsters, maps, genealogies, translation comparisons, even the Gilmert schema in Joyce's retelling. It's intense.
It's going to be free to all of those paid Substack subscribers, and it will be available to purchase as a standalone, which we think is pretty cool. So I think now we better get to the Odyssey. So before we actually ask the big question as to why this book has survived for over 3,000 years, we should probably start with what actually happens in it.
It sat in our imagination for so long. The plot is very simple. Troy has fallen. Everyone else has gone home. One man hasn't. This is the archetype. Dude, I just want to get into my bed. So the Trojan War has ended. Actually, Homer covers the Trojan War in the Iliad. Menelaus has gone to war with his brother Agamemnon when his wife Helen is taken. You may think she fled to Troy. And In the Iliad, the focal point is not Odysseus. He is just one of many kings who is coerced into going into Troy. And every king has now returned home. And this is Odysseus' journey as the king of Ithaca. He has spent 10 years at war, and he is now spending 10 years getting home to his wife Penelope, who is surrounded by suitors who have assumed that he's died. Their son Telemachus grows up without his father and begins searching for news of him.
That is indeed correct. But what we also should note is that whilst, as my learned friend points out, Odysseus was not necessarily up for war, at least to start with, he played a pivotal role in the success of war, at least from his end anyway, because the Trojan horse was actually was something that he devised, and that's really a key point in noting how intelligent, crafty, cunning Odysseus is, but we will come to that. So we have 10 years of war, and then we've got the 10 years that follow that war when Odysseus is essentially ricocheting between monsters, witches, and various disasters. I mean, we're talking Cyclops, we're talking Scylla or Scylla, whatever the correct pronunciation is. We're talking sirens, we're talking banquets, we're talking the whole Helios's cattle disaster. It's all there. You need to imagine that this journey is anything but direct. I guess in our terms, it's a bit like flying from London to Paris, but via Tokyo. You'll see on a map that you've got Ithaca and Troy, kind of about here if you're watching us on YouTube. But Odysseus's Odyssey goes all the way around in this most mythical of journeys that seems to not make any sense. I mean, surely you just should have taken a direct route, but that's not what happens here.
The structure to the book, The Odyssey, is very, very interesting. It's in 24 books, which are in essence chapters. Do not be put off. And it's in this beautiful verse. Well, Wilson's absolutely is, and it's so readable. We'll get to her. Half the poem is actually retrospective. We don't travel with Odysseus in chronological order. It's non-linear.
It is indeed non-linear, and that is something that has influenced, well, one of our favourite books, which is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. Like the Odyssey, this book starts in media res, which means in the thick of the action. And that's something that's very common amongst a lot of Greek epics and tragedies.
And actually, that's really interesting because you were mentioning to me about the film, Soph, that like you were wondering if the film was going to be structured.
I know, I checked that because I think sometimes when a film really struggles against its book counterpart is when it can't pull off structure. I've really seen that. Like, one is We Need to Talk About Kevin. I'm not going to go into that now, but structurally the film for me just didn't work. But to know that this film has adhered to the real structure of the book, I think that's a massive plus and probably really hard to do.
We're so excited to see the film. So books 1 to 4 follow his son Telemachus coming of age, grappling with his home, going out to search for news of his father after Athena, disguised as a friend, mentor, tells him he is alive. So that's books 1 to 4. And then 5 through 8, we finally get present time Odysseus leaving Calypso's island.
Yes. And then next we've got 9 to 12. And this section is when Odysseus has arrived at the Phaeacian court and he recounts his story. The term in Greek is apologoi, which is essentially a story within a story. So you have Odysseus talking about his experiences over the period in getting to where he has now arrived at the court. And in a way, this is where you might deem Odysseus the original unreliable narrator.
And a bard.
Indeed, a bard of his own story.
Exactly. And books 13, you'll come back to present time. It's the nostos, it's the homecoming. Actually, the word nostalgia is derived from that etymologically. Wilson points out the second half of the poem is then like remarkably domestic. It's so interesting how this wonderful epic straddles both the fantastical and the very intimate reality, because once Odysseus reaches Ithaca, the story actually slows quite dramatically. Instead of monsters, we're spending time in kitchens and bedrooms and storerooms.
I think it's worth pointing out, actually, at this point, that we've both been using Emily Wilson's 2017 translation of the Odyssey. So I just want to point out that I read the Iliad during COVID because that was something to do in lockdown. And I read the translation by Robert Fagles. And I must say that I found that much more taxing to read, and it's not about the Iliad as a story. I think the way that Wilson has translated this makes for a really pacey and readable book. And I think part of that is she was so determined to keep to the correct number of lines that was in the Greek original. She doesn't stray from that. And I think that there is quite a variance in number of lines between the different translations. Some are much longer, and she was sure that she had to stick to what was, in her view, right.
And that brings us to one of the biggest controversies that you can find about the Odyssey. We're calling it the translation wars.
Bring it on.
And you can't really talk about the Odyssey without grappling with this question of which translation is best. Classicists have been answering this question for roughly 200 years with the most deeply satisfying phrase, it depends.
Really, the best translation is the one that you're going to be bothered to read. I think that makes a lot of sense. And for me, this one has totally been that. And I would say that, it really does depend on probably when you're reading, where we are in society. That all has an impact.
100%. And actually, I think that most of the translations that were done in the 18th and 19th century are really far off, because people seem to think the Iliad and the Odyssey are some kind of sacred, I saw this Reddit comment, like lofty, pompous literature. But when you look at the Greek, it's actually very, it's basic language. When you look at George Chapman translated this in the 1600s. Alexander Pope, Richard Latimer, Robert Fagles, as you said. Alexander Pope's Odyssey creates Odysseus as this 18th century Christian character, and he translates it into English taste. I actually did find Emily Wilson's translation sometimes a bit jarring because of the modern words. Did you find that?
For me personally, no, but it's an interesting point you make, because actually, when we think about these great seminal texts, and you mentioned the Pope translation and how there was such a Christian aspect to it, I think that often people look at the Odyssey and the Iliad as something close to, I guess, biblical in terms of the loftiness of them.
Yes.
But actually, I would liken them much more to Shakespeare in that I don't think they were written for the elite. I feel like these are something that the masses were really part of. And in fact, who is Homer anyway?
And this is the problem. Because there was many historians and classicists believe that there was no one man, that this is an epic poem that so many people contributed to. And translation is that cultural self-portrait. So when you don't have an author and you don't have a text, there are differences in Greek text. There's not one ancient Greek text. It was rediscovered in the Enlightenment period. Everyone's fighting over what these words even mean.
And actually, when you look at great artists, often there isn't one artist who painted a fresco or a great painting. They had schools around them. And some people have said that would be very much the case in terms of the Odyssey, but also that this was actually originally an oral poem, and it was passed down by bards from around the 10th century onwards. And it's this fluid, formulaic interlocking of tales that have become what is arguably the most influential piece of Western literature. And if you look in the book, there are certain phrases that are always repeated, whether it's rosy-fingered dawn, the wine-dark sea. Those key phrases were used by the bards as a device to make them remember. So they essentially didn't forget their lines. And what's brilliant, I think, about the Wilson translation is she doesn't just repeat phrases, because obviously she is not a bard who is needing to recite this orally and remember everything she's saying. She's writing it down. But it's so interesting for a reader because she varies it up. So you know that it's linking back to that same phrase, but it's not exactly the same. And I found that when I was reading to be a really powerful, I guess, do we call it translatory or literary device?
Yeah, absolutely. God, I love you in your academic phase.
It's when I say things like pathetic fallacy, but I'll save that for another time.
And I went down hours and hours of rabbit holes around the translation.
You mean palace?
And we're going to conclude this section because that's, I think, at the heart of why there's so many disagreements and discussion around the right translation. I don't think that even exists unless you're reading it in the ancient Greek. And then you have another problem. And I want to display this problem with the example of Aristarchus of Samothrace.
Can you say that again?
No. A librarian and scholar working in Alexandria. And this is referenced in an Oberlin lecture that I found, that he spent years on one tiny Greek preposition, ex, because he just didn't accept the societal understanding of that preposition. And every occurrence of the word in Odyssey, he went through to see how Homer used it everywhere.
Wow.
And that's the point. It's a bit like what R.F. Kuang always says in Babel about like translation is never neutral. And I saw another tiny comment on a random Reddit thread on the word palace, which is an archaic epithet of Athena. And the ancients didn't know what it meant, and it doesn't have a secure etymology. It's often connected to the verb to brandish or snake, but it may be of pre-Greek origin, Sophie. That's how old this is.
Yeah, this is seriously old, which I guess is so key because actually it's something so old, but it is still so utterly relevant.
Why is that? And that's our next section. Why is this so relevant still?
Well, I think one of the reasons is the themes are universal, not just to the time they are in, they are universal to humanity. I mean, this is surely the first example of that hero's journey, like that longing for home and what is home and your identity, what's worth living for. I read somewhere beautiful that actually, when you look at the Iliad, at the crux of it is the question of what is actually worth dying for. But when you look at the Odyssey, it's about what's worth living for. And actually, I think that second sentiment is one that we can all connect with, at least to some degree. And I mean, I read something really fascinating. I definitely went down a rabbit hole, but the Odyssey has actually been used by psychologists. There's a psychologist called Jonathan Shea who has written a book called Odysseus in America, Combat Trauma and the Trials of Homecoming.
Fascinating.
And he's looking at that kind of journey home after trauma and how you reintegrate into society. Now, he does not pretend to be a classicist. He's not. He's a psychologist. But he uses Homer's writings to address PTSD. Like, in some ways, this was the original PTSD scenario before that term existed, like thousands and thousands and thousands of years before it existed.
That's fascinating. And actually, can you give us context of what the exact scene is around that PTSD? Because I think it's about the Lotus Eaters.
Yeah, and I love that scene. So the Lotus Eaters is most definitely one of the smaller but indeed massively impactful scenes in the Odyssey that is widely talked about. And it's actually, here's one I folded a page of earlier. So the scene with the Lotus Eaters, and it's only a few lines, but we hear about it from Odysseus retelling it at the banquet in that story within a story. And he talks about how they landed on an island after several days and how they needed to find out who lived there. And I'm just going to give you that little quote here so you can understand what I mean. So the scouts encountered humans, Lotus Eaters, who did not hurt them. They just shared with them their sweet, delicious fruit. But as they ate it, they lost the will to come back and bring news to me. They wanted only to stay there, feeding on lotus with the Lotus Eaters. They had forgotten home. What's really fascinating about that is it has since been looked at as a metaphor for addiction.
Wow.
Because if you think about it, they've been offered something that has really taken them away from what was a very harsh reality that they were in. It made them forget their home, where they were going. And it's been described, what they were offered, as a kind of molly, which, you know, when you think about it now, you could liken that to a drug, no problem. And I think that really connects to this concept of PTSD and the modern relevance really beautifully.
Whilst you were talking, all I was struck by was that's why this is such a blueprint and so canonical, because the Lotus Eater scene is really small. And when we were agonizing over how to structure this episode, we were thinking like we could just take you through books 1 to 24, but that's boring. but we wanted to look at characters and themes. And even just looking at why this is such a blueprint takes us back to a few pages of a text that has inspired books and books on addiction that is so prevalent in society. And I mean, if we look at its impact on literature, obviously Virgil responds to Homer and the Aeneid, which is actually what I had to learn off by heart. Books 9 and 12 for Latin GCSE.
Would you like to give us a rendition?
I probably could. I taught myself.
We'll save that for the Substack.
I was a real nerd. But James Joyce rebuilds the entire architecture of Ulysses, his retelling around it. Atwood gives Penelope her own voice in the Penelopiad. Obviously, our arc saint Madeline Miller recenters Circe. We've got Pac Barker. We've got now Christopher Nolan. This is a story that deserves to be told again and again and again. And actually, classicists often apply a Thucydidean lens to the Odyssey. They say that the narrative of stasis in Ithaca, that Odysseus is just kind of trapped there, is a study of political factions, civil strife, and shifting power structures. And Aristotle says it's the prime example of a properly constructed plot in his Poetics. Its impact cannot be understated.
Yeah, and I think on perhaps a more basic level, to be quite honest with you, I think there are traces of this book everywhere. Even what I'm reading now, when we talk about the journey, what happens, like, yes, we've talked about the hero's journey, but I'm reading The Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. I'm reading it for our book club.
Yes.
And the more work I've done and the more research I've done on the Odyssey, I can see it in that book so clearly. And I think for virtually any book, you're going to find a trace of the Odyssey. And even when you think about it, that right at its heart, you've got the epic, but the intimate inside it. And I think that is something that so many authors, artists take with them on their journeys, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. We always talk about historical fiction in that lens. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie does that so well in Half of a Yellow Sun. You've got this massive, massive war-torn situation, and you've got the very intimate structure of the family and the connections.
And I think that is actually more part of the Odyssey than it's part of the Iliad.
Oh, I totally agree.
I think so.
I totally agree. And actually, this is the story. This is a number of different things. Obviously, it's an epic poem, but it's the story of a family. It's a story of a man who just wants to get home, a mother, a son, capricious gods that we'll talk about. And it's also about the civilization and how it's structured.
But who is it about most? Odysseus. And I think it's really important that we do a little bit of character dissection on Odysseus, because you and I, we feel quite differently about our leading man of this podcast.
We do.
And I want to say that, even the very first line about Odysseus is something that it acts as a sign of his character. When we read the Wilson translation, it calls him a complicated man. In fact, I'm going to just pull it out because I actually love reading a first line on this podcast. I find I'm often reading first lines.
You are.
But Wilson says...
And this is the first line of the entire epic poem.
Very first line of the Odyssey, tell me about a complicated man. Now, there has been a hell of a lot of dispute about this particular translation and her use of the word complicated. The word in Greek, you love saying it, say it.
I do.
You love it.
First of all I'm going to say is that when I started this, and I actually read this a number of years ago. I
can't.
I want to show everyone who's watching, like, this is my version. It's like the Norton, it's the old version. Like,
it's like
this is
Geeks on steroid version.
I got this from a secondhand bookshop online. It's got so many.
Did you get it in 2017?
I think
you probably did.
No, I didn't. I got it a few years later because it's got someone's annotations.
Oh, wow.
I love that. Who went to Cambridge and was doing a classics degree and then sold all their stuff because I've got all of their annotations. But I could just imagine.
Geeks Plus.
I could just imagine Emily Wilson, right? And she's like, oh, tell me about a complicated man.
Exactly.
Do you know what I mean? It's like, men. Anyway, just off that. So the Greek word is polytropos. I should just say, you say I love saying these words.
You do.
I don't know any Greek because I didn't have an education, mother and father. Polytropos. We both want to do Greek degrees.
Yeah, after this, we're in. I'm finding a course now, secretly.
It literally translates as many turns. The etymology of the term combines poly, many or multiple, and tropos, turn, path or way.
And the other translations of that word in relation to Odysseus's character, have been a man of many turns, of twists and turns, or wily even.
Yes.
But as I said, he's certainly complicated, and he's someone that you and I felt very differently about. And actually, one of our first interactions with him in this book, I love this because I love Athena. And
Sophie thinks she's Athena.
I really want to be Athena, and seeing Zendaya in all those outfits at the premiere has just made me want to be her even more. So Athena is the daughter of Zeus, and she basically tells Daddy Zeus to help Odysseus because he's having a terrible time. She's agonizing about his bad luck, and she wants to help him. So she basically becomes his, almost in many ways, and I said this to you, I find that Athena and Odysseus are inextricably intertwined in this book. They share so many similarities. You know, Athena is the goddess of war, but she's the favored child of Zeus, which is a pretty big deal. And her brother Ares is also a god of war, but he's the god of that more kind of violent war, whereas Athena is strategy, planning. Yes. And you can see why she'd relate with Odysseus in that way. And I love seeing that she's almost, Zeus picks her as his favorite child. And then Athena, she picks Odysseus.
So true.
I love that.
And just as a tiny little segue, because there's so many tangents that we could take, the deities in this story do sit behind the multiple characters. There's minor gods such as Circe that we'll get to, but Athena is the main interaction. She guides this story along. She's the architect, whereas Hermes does come down a few times to kind of waddle them along. But the Greek gods, honestly, I think they've got less emotional regulation than the average Love Island contestant. They're so capricious. And Athena is one of them.
But it's really interesting you say that, because I was reading about this with the gods. And the fact is, you can almost look at them as sort of hanging around in the upper echelons of the other world, wherever they are. And they're bored. Yes. What are they doing? They're bored, they've got nothing to do. And then you look at Odysseus, and actually his name derives directly from the Greek word for pain and suffering. And what's fascinating is that is a huge part of being human, the pain and the suffering. And yet, we'll come to learn, it's something that Odysseus wants, because even when he's offered immortality, by Calypso, who traps him on his journey, he says no, he'll take the pain and the suffering. And it actually makes you think, is it better to be a god? Well, probably not.
This is one of the reasons I don't like him. Trapped. He's trapped on an island, yeah?
She's hot.
She's sleeping with him every night. Hot. But he's sobbing in the day on the beach.
There's a lot of tears.
Lamenting his home. But he's trapped on an island with a magnificently beautiful woman.
But he is lamenting his home, and that's the point. Look, I actually like Odysseus, and I'm not sure what the worldview is on him, but I think Homer, whether he's one guy or lots of people, the point is you cannot comfortably, in my opinion, place Odysseus in any one camp. You can't say he's a great bloke. You can't say he's a bad bloke. But what you can say above all is he is an extremely human and relatable bloke. And I think it's precisely this that makes this book so relevant all through the ages. We see ourselves in elements of his character. Nobody's perfect. He's so flawed. I get that, but I kind of love him for it.
Okay, well, what I will say is that if for anyone who's just thinking 1 minute he was offered immortality and said no, there's, interestingly on this, the Greek concept of fate. Moira dictates a hero's ultimate destiny. Odysseus possessed the free will. The gods weren't in control of him. And his suffering was viewed by the gods as a just punishment for his arrogance, which is one of the reasons I really don't like him. Rather than an inescapable, cosmic curse, though he was cursed. You're right, he's human. You're right. He's deeply flawed and deeply human. He thinks he's God's gift to humanity, Sophie. And he makes horrific decisions. And we're going to get to those. But you were going to give the example of the Cyclops.
Yes, because I know you'll see that scene and you think, oh my gosh, he's really arrogant. But let's talk about it. So he arrives at the cave of the Cyclops, Polyphemus, if I pronounce that correctly. I hope I have. Another folded page in my book. But he arrives and he does go into his cave. We'll come to that. But when Polyphemus asks who he is, he describes himself, he calls himself no man, like I am no man.
Utis.
Utis, exactly. I know you love saying the Greek. Cyclops, you asked my name, I will reveal it. Then you must give the gift you promised me of hospitality. My name is No Man. My family and friends all call me No Man. Now, I think if you speak Greek, this kind of means more. But ultimately, when he then stabs Polyphemus in his eye, his one eye, he is a Cyclops. So that's not just like, oh, I can't see in one eye. It's like, now I've lost my sight. That is horrific. When Polyphemus is screaming for help and he's asked who did this and he says no man, well, the assumption then of those listening is that no man did it. It's kind of just happened. But then as he leaves, Odysseus cannot help but claim, I guess, the glory of committing the crime and saying, Cyclops, if any mortal asks how your eye was mutilated and made blind, say that Odysseus, the city sacker, Laertes' son who lives in Ithaca, destroyed your sight.
What a schmuck!
But I don't think, I don't look at him the way you do. I think you think, oh my God, that's so awful. It is bad, but I kind of just think, oh, you're a bit of a moron, aren't you?
Okay, I have many reasons for not liking Odysseus, and I think every generation creates their own Odysseus. He is the ultimate unreliable narrator. But in the end of the day, it's like robbing a house, then leaving a note giving your address.
I guess the way I see it is more that, he was chasing that chaos. He was chasing that honor, and all of them were.
Yeah, you're not wrong. I just found it, but you've said it to me before, that this is the moment where Poseidon decides that, because this is his favoured son, that he's been attacked.
Yeah.
And also he's totally, and we're going to get to hospitality as a theme later on, but he has not been the guest that he should be.
No.
And you wouldn't want him as your manager. You always say that to me.
I always say that. He's a bad manager. I mean, he gets to the end and he's the only one living. Well, where's the rest of the team? Where's the C-suite? They're all gone.
Why? Because he's made stupid decisions. And listen, he's notorious. He was known as a trickster. He wasn't actually warmongering. Odysseus tries very hard to actually avoid going to war. In the Iliad, it was prophesied that it would take him 20 years to return. He feigns madness by ploughing his fields with an ox and a donkey, sowing them with salt. And his ruse is uncovered when Palamedes places his infant son Telemachus in the path of the plough and he veers. But he's just the ultimate flawed leader. His survival instincts are there. I know that Athena loves him because he's wily as opposed to Achilles' strength and brute brutality. But his fatal curiosity and lack of caution in dangerous situations leads to the demise of everyone around him. And I know we're going to talk about women now, but the way that he deals with the slave girls at the end of this book is an absolute atrocity.
Okay, I take that point. We'll come to it, but Chaya, even you can surely admit that some of the views that he expresses about women are actually pretty damn progressive, compared to probably what was going on at the time. When he encounters Nausicaa, the princess, and she asks him what makes a good marriage, he actually says, as one of the three things, it's about a like-mindedness between husband and wife. And I do not think that is something that everybody was going around shouting about then, do you?
No, the Greek word is homophrosini, like-mindedness. Yeah, I agree. Madeline Miller said that in a lecture that you pointed out to me. But you're right, women were subjected and they were second-class citizens, which obviously is diluted when we think of Penelope, which we are now coming to. But he did have progressive views, but then we get to the scene at the end. So now I'm going to tell you about a really important and key scene which has made so many people uncomfortable. So he's in Ithaca and he is with all the suitors and he's disguised as a beggar, and he knows that the girls, the slave girls, have been assisting from when he connects with his son. They have been assisting the suitors who are in essence his adversary, right? They are the ones that he has gone to attack, to procure back his home. He has been told by Telemachus that his home is under siege by these suitors. And these girls, Odysseus talks about them, as does Telemachus. And they are described as being dragged through their home, being molested. Emily Wilson translates one of the words as raped. And when he has killed all the suitors, he then tells his son to hack at the girls' bodies, the 12 slave girls' bodies that have either assisted / been molested by the suitors that have been vying for his wife Penelope's affections, and they are slaughtered. And it is the most horrific scene, and you just are sitting there thinking, these girls had no autonomy. One of them maybe is a bit wily and she's helping them and she is mocking Odysseus, who's this beggar. But they did not deserve that. And particularly Margaret Atwood in the Penelopiad portrays these girls, as do many others, as these victims that Odysseus just slaughters.
Well, I think even the word slave is important to touch on, because in a lot of translations, it's not actually the word that's used to describe these slave girls. They use instead words like maids or maid servants, which suggests that they had some kind of agency. But by using the word slave, Wilson makes it clear that they actually had no agency whatsoever. And I think that makes this scene much harder to stomach than perhaps it would be if you were reading a different translation.
And that's why I don't like Odysseus.
That's why you don't like Odysseus. I accept that point. It's not great. It's not great. Like, why did that happen?
There are many interpretations. People say that the classicists say, well, he had to do that because he was asserting his rights, that he was clearing the home of anything that had been tainted, and because the suitors had interacted physically with these girls, they were tainted. But I don't think it's a good look.
No, it's not ideal. Although I've got to be honest, I still kind of like him.
That's okay.
I still kind of like him. But it's interesting when you think of agency and these slave girls, because actually Penelope herself, she's a key character in this, although she's not in it for loads. She's hugely important. So much of this Odyssey is about her. And she actually does have an element of choice as a woman. She has that. And, you know, it's Penelope who ultimately outwits Odysseus in a scene towards the end. As you mentioned, he's disguised. But when he arrives back to Penelope, all the suitors are dead, as you say, and she's really cautious. And everybody around her is saying, this guy's Odysseus, it's your husband. And she's just not going to accept that. She just doesn't. I mean, I suppose if you think about it, look, he's been gone for 20 years. Like, things change. He's probably looking quite different. We don't have ID the way we do now. It's a whole different world. And she spent 20 years waiting. Like, you're going to like have your guard up a little bit. So actually, she outwits him by saying to a servant, move our marital bed out of our bedroom. And Odysseus's immediate reaction is one of kind of complete shock, and he protests. He's like, the bed can't be moved, because he knows it can't be moved. I think it was all carved around like an olive tree that's all part of the whole structure of the bedroom. And only the two of them know that detail. Only they know that the bed can't be moved. So you've got his genuine shock, and Penelope then knows that he's her husband. And it's kind of a brilliant moment, because it's all about shared knowledge, but it also shows kind of how she ultimately outwits him and the cunning that she has. And she's called cunning in the text. She's described as that too.
Oh, constantly. Which is interesting, because when we come to Helen, so the parallels between Penelope is really interesting, because Penelope as Odysseus's wife is always portrayed as this choice of being able to choose the suitors. And when she is literally waiting out the clock in the 10 years that Odysseus has disappeared after the fall of Troy, she is weaving the shroud, the funeral shroud of Odysseus' father Laertes, who has not died yet. And
takes a while, though, to make a decent shroud, I guess.
It does, but she unwinds it every night. Athena's Aegis is above her, and she unwinds it every night, and she keeps them waiting. It's like, well, she's not just been taken. And Telemachus is also being told, you know, just give your mother in marriage. Laertes is just grieving the loss of his son in the background. And this concept of agency with the women. Helen is constantly portrayed as this, the whore of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships, obviously Christopher Marlowe says. But she at times portrays herself as having a choice or having been tricked. She says to Priam, if she had known what was going to happen, she would never have gone, which insinuates choice. Then many times she talks about being tricked. It's interesting that you say that you think that she's tricking him. I think that she's absolutely petrified to in any way be physical with any man that is not. I will just say that for anyone that's like, well, why did Odysseus disguise himself even from his wife up until a point? Odysseus was warned by Agamemnon, and again, this is in books 5 to 12 when he visits the underworld.
I love the idea of just visiting the underworld. I think it's fascinating.
He visits to try and, Circe tells him that he needs to visit the underworld to find out how he's supposed to get home, and that's when he finds out his mother has died, and he speaks to Agamemnon, who also doesn't know has died. Agamemnon was killed by his wife Clytemnestra, and people were like, Agamemnon laments that. I'm like, dude, you killed your daughter to get the right winds to go to Troy.
They are so brutal, these guys. I mean, it's like on another level. Like it's
really
mega.
And
it's ridiculous.
And he warns, because obviously Agamemnon comes back in, full splendor and then is killed either by his wife Clytemnestra or her lover, and there's a family feud there. But Agamemnon warns Odysseus to be disguised. And there's a lot of discourse around at what point Penelope recognizes her husband Odysseus. Philip Harsh, in his seminal work, thinks that she recognizes him as early as book 19. Sheila Mergren also thinks, these are academics that I've been reading into, the dynamics of disguise and recognition. She thinks the withholding of her knowledge is a calculated power move. And the fact is that she's weaponizing. So the way that they kill the suitors is they organize a bow contest. And Odysseus is this like decrepit beggar that Athena has disguised as that. And then he's the only one that's able to use the bow. And then he basically starts picking them off one by one. And Aristotle actually points out a key feature of the Odyssey is this masterful use of recognition, agnorisis, the shift from ignorance to knowledge.
When you talk about disguise, I actually love the fact that in the end, one of the giveaways of Odysseus's true self is the scar that he has, a scar from when he was a child. And it's his nurse who he loved. I think she's called Eurycleia, if I said that right. But he's basically deceived everybody. But she, when she's washing his foot, she notices that scar. And to me, it's like you can deceive people with your words, you can deceive them with your appearance, but that on your body, you can't hide from that. You can't hide yourself with that. And it's like the mark of the life he's lived. It's kind of who he is, and it's still there, and she sees it. And I just think that's a really important point when you're looking at him as a character, because it links his present with kind of where he's come from as far back as his childhood. It's indisputably him now. You can't shy away from that.
That's so interesting.
And that is, in many ways, the heart of this story, because it's all about the return, going home. Can you be that same person? You've been away for 20 years. Who are you? And it's not just about the place. Obviously, Ithaca is vital, and we know that. But it's also, home is about your relationships to the people that you love or you're with or whatever. That's a fundamental part of home. And not to sound cheesy, but when you think about it, this is something I've said to my kids, like when we've moved house. It sounds silly, but they'll get really upset, to move. They were really sad when we left our house. But actually, I've said to them, home is about the people. It's not the place. It's been great, but actually it's about the people and what you have with those people. And that's so much a sentiment that is here in this book, I think.
It absolutely is, though. I think that the reason that Odysseus wants to go home, going back to the central question of this book, is like he's offered, when he's with Calypso, this magnificent beauty, and he's offered immortality. And even I think Circe could have offered him immortality.
Well, interestingly, he didn't want to leave Circe. Indeed. He only left because he was reminded by his crew that they had somewhere they had home to get to.
I think it's all about patriarchal relationships.
Oh, I disagree.
Well, come on. I'm sorry.
disagree.
Why does he want to go back to Ithaca? He look out, like, what are you saying? He's just desperately in love with Penelope.
No, but I think he genuinely believes they have a good marriage. He said that what's important to him in a marriage.
Whilst he's sleeping with all these other women.
We're going to disagree about this point because fundamentally we see him differently. I'm not excusing his behaviour, but let's be real. We have to look at it in the context of the time. And, that kind of was the way things rolled. It was 20 years. I'm not justifying it. It's a really long time.
We were on a break.
We were...
We were on a break.
We were on a break, but he could have stayed and had a lovely life. And I know you're going to say, well, actually, that's not why he didn't stay with Calypso. He didn't stay with her because he wanted to be the master of his own story. And, but I don't think that makes him a bad bloke.
She would have made him immortal.
But he wanted to go back.
He would have been.
He wanted to go back. And I did. He wanted to go back home. He wanted to go back to his wife, his son. He wanted to go back there. He's gone back there. And I think that is at the heart of why this is so relevant, because we can relate to that.
I agree. I just think that the reason he wants to go back is not that romantic.
Okay, well, then I'm not saying it's romantic. I think it's kind of what makes us human. It's like we want to go back to...
And we get back to the question of whether why Sophie and I disagree so strongly about Odysseus. Sorry, when he gets home, does he run and hug everyone? No,
but we know why.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Look at the parallels.
He's warned by Agamemnon, yeah? Once all the suitors have died, how does he approach his father Laertes, Sophie?
Oh.
The man is crying and grieving, and he's like, hi, I'm from another island. I might have seen your son. Great, thanks for that.
I think we're going to have to agree to disagree on our Odysseus stance. I think that's... I would like to know what the listeners think. Let's see what happens with that.
I will say, so we touched upon double standards, and there are a few themes now that we're going to tease out, because we could sit here and talk to you about all of the key scenes, but I think it's much more interesting to question these characters. So the double standards of sexual fidelity are so prevalent in this book.
We've just touched on it, but they are massive.
Both from the slave girls and from Penelope herself not being even visible to the suitors she she's veiled.
Yeah, and Odysseus
he's sleeping around.
Calypso, Circe.
I know this is me on my feminist train, but I think there's so looking through this as from a feminist lens, Circe and Calypso are really interesting. But the other double standard that I found, and I found that so jarring, but then I also think Wilson talks about hospitality Xenia being this absolutely structural point.
It's like a scaffold to everything in this book.
So what do we mean by that? Every time Odysseus is traveling, and he's traveling so much throughout the 10 years, the whole premise is, how am I going to be received? Are these people savages? Or are they people that respect the laws around hospitality? And it was so incongruent and awful that you've got these people that can simultaneously believe that one should treat strangers with dignity, but then also believe that you can own human beings and rape and pillage and steal and colonize. But have you offered your guests the right slice of meat? It's so dystopian.
Yeah, it's totally dystopian when you look at it like that. And I think it's this organizing principle of life, but it's actually just really quite screwed up when you're looking at it from the outside. How does that even work? But it is so key to societal functioning at the time, if we can call it that. When you talk about colonization, one thing that sat with me whilst I was reading this book, massively stayed there in my head, was actually the monsters themselves. Because I listened to a podcast where a number of proper, scholars of this stuff said, actually, the least interesting thing about the Odyssey are the monsters. And I get that, I suppose it's obvious that the monsters would be interesting. It's exciting, the story of Cyclops, the story of Scylla. And, I love, even for that story, it's so relevant now because Circe tells Odysseus that he has to travel wrapping round Scylla rather than near, I think it's the whirlpool of Charybdis. And that is where the phrase torn between a rock and a hard place quite literally comes from. I think there's an American writer and in an American book where it's been used, but it is derived from this point.
And let's explain who Scylla is and what the situation is.
So Scylla is a monster, and she is a sea monster, and she is many-headed. Is that right? Have I got that right?
Yes.
She stays in this spot by the sea, and she must look, I mean, let's be honest, she's not going to be a looker, is she? She just isn't.
She's horrifying.
She's quite horrifying. Odysseus has to navigate the sea around her and accepts that if he goes close to Scylla, he will lose some of his men. But if he doesn't and he goes the other way towards, I don't know, we'll call that the hard place, I'm not sure, but Charybdis, he will lose the whole boat will be like swept under and there's no hope. So his boat goes around where Scylla is and they lose 6 men. And that is a lesson to us all of, you have to sometimes accept that it's the lesser of 2 evils here that we're dealing with. And he takes that and he knows that he's going to lose men, but it's better than losing everyone. But what's fascinating about Scylla as a monster was that she, from what I understand of Greek myth, and I wish I could do more of this, but she was was she a princess? I'm not sure if she was a princess, but she was definitely a beautiful young woman. And she loved Glaucus, and Circe also liked Glaucus. And so she turned Scylla into this awful looking monster so that I guess she was not a threat to her. And I think what's so fascinating is that, okay, you look at Scylla and you're like, she's a monster. But actually, there's so many more layers to this. And really, when you look at this story with the monsters, I get it why kids and young readers are going to like the monsters. And I also understand why many more lofty academics are going to say, oh, the monsters actually aren't the interesting parts. But in my mind, in this book, the worst monsters are not necessarily the monsters, if that makes sense.
100%. Agamemnon kills his own child to get to Troy.
And it's not just Scylla. Look at Polyphemus with his eye. Like, there was something incredibly human about that.
Very interesting you say that, because I read an academic paper on this, because we go back to hospitality now, because Odysseus says, well, let's see how he responds to a guest. It's like, A, you've just broken into his home and lied in wait. And B, the way that he organises his sheep and his flock and everything is very civilised. And it's the othering of people that you pointed at. It's the othering of anyone that's not part of their civilization. And literally the organising infrastructure is hospitality, because there's no Airbnbs, there's no hotels. It's literally
you can't prove your ID anyway.
It's the only way you travel is by relying on the beneficence of strangers. And that is how they operate.
But that's also, it links beautifully to Circe, because look at Circe. She's this witch, but she's beautiful. And in fact, she's the only one that Odysseus wants to stay with. He has to be reminded to go. And also look at how she has that power to turn his men into pigs.
She does.
Which is what she does. And it's just this concept that no one is necessarily all they seem.
No.
And that is something that is such an important lesson. We judge people so much based on where they're from, what they look like. It's all there. And it's over 3,000 years old.
And what's interesting, exactly leading on from that, is this principle of theoxany, which is, what if the stranger at your door was actually a god? And the hospitality shown towards a disguised divinity is always at the background. It's like, well, it could be Athena, it could be Zeus. They actually think Odysseus could be a god.
And he is called godlike throughout.
All the time. Athena repeatedly appears as disguised. And this is where you kind of see the similarities a bit between like the Old Testament and so many other old texts. But hospitality is considered this moral test. And that I found so jarring. And that is very atypical of its time, that they had so much brutality and violence, and then they were so fixated on being hospitable because that was your calling card. And Wilson says, the poem is concerned above all with the duties and dangers involved in welcoming foreigners into one's home.
I mean, that could have been written today.
Absolutely.
It could have been written today. Absolutely. There is so much more here, and we're not going to pretend that we've covered nearly everything to do with the Odyssey. I'd like to think we've done a little more than scratch the surface, and whether you've read the book or haven't read the book, whether you've seen the film or you're thinking about seeing the film, that there will be something that you can take from this. And hopefully it's something that will stay with you. But it's precisely because we have so much information, right, that we are actually putting it in this other format, our Falling Further literary companion, we'll call it for now. And we will give you more information on that, because we hope that will be a really handy resource for you to have and dip into and dip out of as you wish.
Absolutely. But I think the presiding message of this podcast episode is that actually the Odyssey is a canonical text that underpins so much of literature, and it is just only because of its inherent humanity. And though it's about gods and monsters and beasts and wars, it's also about a family that just wants to be reunited, and a man who is so incredibly deeply flawed, and women that are subject to double standards, and not much has changed. And we are so excited to watch the film, and we are going to come back with a review of the film where we kind of compare and contrast the characters. So definitely look out for that.
And I also want to say, like, as a closing note before we sign off, don't be daunted by it, because actually it's so incredibly readable if you get the right translation. But I would highly recommend the Wilson for that. Like, it's a very, very readable translation. And if you don't take anything from this, but I hope you will certainly take something from the book itself.
Absolutely. And if you have read the Odyssey and you want to know where to go next, I mean, we are surrounded by stacks of books and retellings that we love. Obviously, go to Miller. Circe and the Song of Achilles.
Circe, both of them are stunning.
But the Circe is very much Odyssean, but obviously the Song of Achilles is much more predicated towards the Iliad. I would recommend Margaret Atwood's The Penelopead. It's written in verse. It is absolutely beautiful. It's quite brilliant. Hard to read. It's so sad.
Brilliant. Short, though.
Very short.
Plus, all of the Pat Barker books, I mean, they are about Achilles and Troy, but there's the journey home as well.
Yes.
And if you want to learn more about the myths, all the Stephen Fry books are fantastic. Mythos Heroes, there is Troy too. I haven't read that, but there is also very relevant Odyssey. That will help you.
And from an historical fiction perspective, Constanza Cassati, Clytemnestra.
I really want to read that.
I've read it and I hated Agamemnon with the strength of 1,000 suns. But obviously, I mean, if you're a bit more classical, I would very much recommend Euripides, The Trojan Women, as a very good play around this. But also we have to mention Natalie Haynes.
Yeah, and I love her book, the one that has all the different chapters on the different women. The ancient,
Pandora's Jar.
So good. This one, I've got it here. And I'm scared all my books are going to fall. But it's here, Pandora's Jar.
And she wrote
The Women of the
1,000 Ships, which was amazing. And Nikita Gill, Hecate and Styx is phenomenal. The thing is that Greek retellings, mythological retellings.
They do something to me.
They're exploding in popularity. They have been for quite some time.
Phenomenal. They are phenomenal, and there is a reason why they are so popular, and there is a reason why 3,000 odd years later, we're still talking about the Odyssey.
Absolutely. And in our Falling Further guide, there will be a huge section of bibliography and recommended reads as well, because there's so many to find out there.
It's almost a bit nauseating.
We hope you've enjoyed. We've thoroughly enjoyed preparing for this episode.
We really have. All those many, many, many hours.
But do check out the Falling Further guide, because I think there's a lot in there.
See you next time. Bye.